The summer air was thick with heat, the kind that made sidewalks shimmer like waves and sent neighbors retreating beneath the shade of their porches. On a quiet suburban street in Santa Clarita, California, the world moved slowly, lawn sprinklers clicking in rhythmic bursts, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the distant aroma of barbecue. But for one little girl, today was anything but ordinary. 7-year-old Emma perched on a small wooden stool, her tiny feet swinging just above the ground as she adjusted her lemonade stand. It wasn't anything fancy. A simple folding table draped with a checkered cloth, a sweating pitcher of lemonade standing proudly in the center, and a neat stack of plastic cups waiting beside it. But the true centerpiece was her handmade sign, a burst of color scrawled in big, uneven letters. Lemonade for hope. Emma's focus was unwavering. She straightened the sign, making sure it was visible from the street, and flashed a hopeful smile at every passing car. Unlike most kids selling lemonade for extra pocket money, Emma had a much bigger reason for being there. She was raising money for her own chemotherapy. It wasn't something any child should have to worry about, yet here she was, 7 years old, battling leukemia, and determined to help her parents pay for the treatments keeping her alive. The past year had been filled with hospital rooms, endless tests, and exhausting treatments that drained her body but never her spirit. From the porch, Claire, Emma's mother, watched with a bittersweet smile. Pride and heartache twisted together in her chest as she took in the sight of her little girl, whose once golden locks had been reduced to soft, uneven tufts. Despite everything, Emma's brown eyes sparkled with determination, her resilience shining brighter than the summer sun. A jogger passed by, offering a polite nod but not stopping. A car slowed slightly, the driver glancing at the stand before continuing down the road. Emma didn't let it faze her. She simply adjusted her hat, poured herself a small cup of lemonade, and waited. Her first customer of the day arrived moments later. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor with a slow but steady stride, made her way over, her cane tapping against the pavement. "How much for a cup, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm and kind. $1, Emma answered with a bright smile. Mrs. Henderson reached into her purse, pulling out a $10 bill. "Keep the change, dear," she said softly, her gaze lingering on the words "Lemonade for Hope" written across the sign. Emma's fingers curled around the bill, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she beamed. As the day wore on, more neighbors stopped by. Some bought lemonade, some dropped spare change into the glass jar labeled donations, and others simply came to offer words of encouragement. The kindness surrounding Emma's small stand grew, but even with each generous donation, she knew she was still far from reaching the amount her family needed. Still, she didn't waver. She had no idea that this would be the day everything changed, that soon someone unexpected would step into her world and turn her small act of hope into something much, much bigger. Before Emma ever set up her lemonade stand, before she understood what words like chemotherapy and leukemia meant, she was just a normal little girl, full of energy, laughter, and a love for adventure. She spent her days running barefoot through the backyard, climbing trees despite her mother's warnings, and racing her pink bike down the sidewalk, the tassels on the handlebars fluttering wildly in the wind. She painted colorful, messy pictures that filled the fridge, made up songs about anything and everything, and believed the world was full of magic. Then, almost a year ago, everything changed. It started with small things, getting tired more easily, taking longer naps after school, and bruises that seemed to appear out of nowhere. At first, her parents brushed it off. "She's probably just going through a growth spurt," her dad, Brian, had said, though Claire couldn't ignore the gnawing worry in her chest. Then came the fevers, low grade at first, but soon spiking so high they wouldn't break. Emma stopped eating as much, started losing weight. The once boundless energy that defined her seemed to fade, and one evening, as she sat coloring at the kitchen table, Claire noticed something that sent an icy fear through her veins. Emma could barely hold her crayon. Her tiny fingers trembled, the simple act of pressing color to paper suddenly too much. That was the moment Claire knew. Something was very, very wrong. The doctor's office smelled like antiseptic, and the bright posters on the walls did little to soften the anxiety clawing at Claire's insides. Emma, still unaware of what was happening, swung her legs off the exam table, humming softly to herself. Then came the tests, the blood draws, the long, uncomfortable silence as they waited for answers. When the doctor finally returned, his expression alone told Claire everything she needed to know. She barely heard the words, leukemia. The room seemed to shrink around her. Her pulse roared in her ears as she reached blindly for Brian's hand. What does this mean?" she managed to choke out. The doctor's voice was gentle but unrelenting. "It means Emma has cancer." The world tilted. Emma, sensing the sudden change in her parents' energy, glanced between them with wide eyes. "Mommy, Daddy," she whispered. "Why are you sad?" Claire forced a smile, though her throat felt too tight to breathe. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a hand over the soft blonde strands of her hair. "We're just worried, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. "But everything's going to be okay. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you get better." But the days that followed proved that okay was a long, long road away. The hospital became their second home. The nurses became familiar faces. Emma endured round after round of chemotherapy, each treatment leaving her weaker, the side effects stealing away more of her childhood. Brian worked longer hours to cover the staggering medical bills, stress deepening the lines on his face. Claire stayed by Emma's side, holding her hand through the worst of it, whispering words of comfort even as her own heart shattered. Despite it all, Emma never stopped being Emma. She found joy in the smallest things: a joke from a kind nurse, a new coloring book from a visitor, the cozy warmth of her favorite blanket. One night, as she lay curled up in the living room, coloring while her parents whispered in hushed, worried tones at the kitchen table, she suddenly looked up and said something that took Claire by surprise. "What if I did something to help?" Claire turned, walking over and kneeling beside her. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma tapped her crayon against her chin thoughtfully. "I could sell lemonade," she said simply. "People like lemonade. Maybe they'd buy it to help me." Claire's breath caught. The sheer innocence of the idea was both beautiful and devastating. She reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Emma's ear, her fingers shaking slightly. "That's a wonderful idea, honey," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll make it happen." And so the lemonade stand was born. The idea of a lemonade stand started as a passing thought, one of those innocent, hopeful dreams that children have. But once Emma decided on something, she made it happen. The next morning, despite feeling tired from her last round of chemotherapy, she sat at the kitchen table with a stack of paper and a box of markers, carefully crafting her sign. Bold, uneven letters spelled out lemonade for hope, each stroke filled with determination. Around the words, she drew a bright yellow sun and a red heart, the way only a child could, imperfect, yet bursting with feeling. Claire watched her from across the table, her chest tight with emotion. Emma's tiny hands trembled slightly as she gripped the markers, a visible reminder of how much the treatments had taken from her. But her spirit, that was untouched. When she finished, she held up the sign proudly. "Do you think people will like it, Mommy?" Claire forced back the lump in her throat and smiled. "I think they're going to love it." That Saturday morning, as the sun climbed high into the sky, Emma's lemonade stand came to life. Dressed in her favorite yellow sundress, the one she insisted matched her lemonade, Emma sat on a stool in the driveway, her straw hat shielding her face from the heat. The folding table, covered in a checkered cloth, held a glass pitcher filled to the brim with freshly made lemonade. Condensation dripped down the sides, glistening in the sunlight. Beside it, a neat stack of plastic cups sat ready, and in front of them, a mason jar labeled donations. The first hour was slow. A jogger passed by, offering a friendly wave but not stopping. A car slowed as it neared the stand, the driver glancing curiously before driving on. Emma didn't seem discouraged. She simply adjusted her hat, poured herself a tiny cup of lemonade and waited. Then finally her first customer arrived. Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly woman from 2 houses down, shuffled over with her cane tapping softly against the pavement. "Good morning, Emma," she greeted warmly. Emma's face lit up. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. Would you like some lemonade? It's only $1 a cup." Mrs. Henderson smiled as she pulled out a $10 bill. "I'd love some, sweetheart. Keep the change." Emma handed her the cup carefully, her fingers barely steady, but her excitement undeniable. "Thank you so much." As Mrs. Henderson walked away, more neighbors began to stop by. A young mum pushing a stroller, a group of kids from Emma's school dragging their parents along, and even Mr. Alvarez, the cheerful mailman who had seen the stand on his route. "What's this all about, kiddo?" he asked, already pulling out his wallet. Emma pointed to her sign. "I'm raising money for my chemo," she said simply. Her honesty was disarming. People hesitated for only a second before slipping extra bills into the donation jar, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. By noon, word had spread. Cars started pulling over. Drivers stepped out to buy lemonade and chat with Claire, who sat nearby in a lawn chair, watching the donations grow with every passing hour. The air buzzed with laughter, the smell of fresh-cut grass and sunscreen lingering as more people arrived. Emma, despite the heat and exhaustion, kept going. Every cup she poured, every dollar she received, felt like a tiny victory. Then, just as she was wiping sweat from her forehead, something made her stop. A man was walking toward the stand. Tall, dressed in a worn leather jacket despite the heat, he moved with a quiet confidence. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but there was something about him, something familiar, though Emma couldn't place why. He stopped a few feet away, studying the stand with a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Emma blinked up at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Hi there, would you like some lemonade? It's only $1 a cup." The man crouched slightly, resting his hands on his knees so he was at eye level with her. $1, huh?" His voice was deep, gravelly, carrying the weight of someone who had lived a lot of life. "Seems like a good deal. What's all this for?" Emma pointed to her sign again. "It's for my chemo," she said simply, her small voice unwavering. "I want to help my mom and dad so they don't have to worry so much." Something shifted in the man's expression, a softness, a quiet understanding. He glanced at the donation jar, then back at Emma. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a checkbook. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his pen poised over the paper. "Emma." He nodded, scribbling something onto the check. "Well, Emma," he said, tearing the check from the book and handing it to her, "I think it's time this lemonade stand got the recognition it deserves." Emma unfolded the slip of paper, her small hands trembling as she read the number written on it. Her breath caught, her heart pounded. This is $50,000, she whispered, barely able to say the words out loud. Claire, who had been watching from a distance, shot to her feet. 50,000, she repeated, her voice shaking as she rushed to Emma's side. Her eyes darted to the check, then to the man standing before them. I don't even know what to say." The man smiled. "You already said it," he replied. "This little girl here, she's the one doing the real work." Someone in the crowd murmured, "Wait a minute, is that Clint Eastwood?" The name spread through the small gathering like wildfire. Gasps, whispers. A few phones lifted into the air. Emma looked at the man curiously. "Are you famous or something?" she asked, tilting her head. Clint Eastwood chuckled, crouching down again so he was level with her. "A little bit," he admitted. "But not as famous as you're gonna be, kid." The crowd erupted into laughter, the energy shifting from stunned silence to pure joy. But as Emma clutched the check in her small hands, something told her this was only the beginning. Something big was about to happen. For a few long, breathless seconds, the world around Emma seemed to blur. $50,000. She stared at the check, her small fingers gripping the paper tightly as if she were afraid it might disappear. The number printed in neat, inked strokes was too big for her to fully understand, but she knew it was important. She knew it meant something huge. Claire, standing beside her, was at a complete loss for words. Her mouth opened, then closed, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts as she looked between her daughter and Clint Eastwood. I don't even know what to say," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. This is unbelievable." Clint just smiled, his rugged features softening. "You've already said it," he replied. "This little girl, she's the real star here." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone had snapped a photo. Another whispered excitedly to their friend, "Can you believe this? Clint Eastwood just walked up and dropped 50 grand like it was nothing." Emma, still processing, looked up at Clint. "Are you really famous?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she wasn't entirely convinced. Clint chuckled, the deep timbre of his laugh carrying through the warm afternoon air. "A little bit," he admitted with a smirk, "but not as famous as you're gonna be, kid." The crowd laughed, and the tension broke into something warm, something filled with pure joy. Emma grinned. She didn't fully understand why everyone was acting so excited, but she could feel it. Something big had just happened. And then, as if a switch had flipped, it was like a floodgate had opened. Mr. Alvarez, the neighborhood mailman, stepped forward, pulling a $50 bill from his wallet. "You know what? Clint's got the right idea. Let's help this little warrior out." A woman in the crowd nodded, digging into her purse. "Yes, let's do this." One by one, people reached into their pockets, 20s, 50s, even crumpled ones and 5s. Some people didn't even take a cup of lemonade. They just dropped money into the donation jar and walked away smiling. The small stand, once just a child's hopeful project, had turned into a movement before Emma's very eyes. Claire could hardly keep up, her hands shaking as she tried to organize the growing pile of donations. Tears streamed down her face, but this time, they weren't from worry or fear. They were from something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time: relief, gratitude, hope. Emma, though exhausted, couldn't stop smiling. "Does this mean I don't have to sell lemonade anymore?" she asked with a giggle, glancing up at Clint. He chuckled. "You don't have to, kid," he said, crouching down so he could look her in the eyes. "But something tells me you're going to keep finding ways to make the world a little brighter. It's just who you are." Emma beamed, her heart swelling with pride. And then someone in the crowd shouted, "Group photo!" Within minutes, neighbors were huddled together, grinning broadly with Emma and Clint at the center. The photographer, a local reporter who had happened to be passing by, snapped the shot that would later go viral. A little girl with a bright hand-drawn sign, standing beside one of Hollywood's biggest legends, surrounded by a community that had come together for something bigger than any of them had imagined. By the time the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the donation jar was nearly overflowing. Claire could barely believe it. The little stand that had started the day with a simple goal had become something extraordinary. But just as she thought the excitement had reached its peak, Clint leaned in close to her and said quietly, "I've got some friends who'd like to help too. Don't be surprised if you hear from them in the next few days." Claire's breath caught. She could hardly process what was happening. She wiped at her damp cheeks, shaking her head. "I don't even know how to thank you." Clint gave a small, knowing smile. "Just take care of that little girl of yours." Then, with one last tip of an imaginary hat, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street as casually as he had arrived. The neighborhood watched him go, the weight of what had just happened settling into their hearts. But the story wasn't over. The impact of Clint's generosity, and the chain reaction it had sparked, was about to ripple far beyond this little suburban street. By the next morning, Emma's lemonade stand wasn't just the talk of the neighborhood, it was the talk of the entire town. Photos from the previous day had already spread across social media, shared by neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had passed by. The image of Emma standing proudly with her Lemonade for Hope sign beside Clint Eastwood was everywhere. And then something even bigger happened. A news outlet picked up the story, then another. By midday, Claire's phone was ringing non-stop. Local newspapers wanted interviews. A radio station asked if Emma could come on the air. A morning TV show left a voicemail asking if they'd be willing to fly out for an appearance. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, staring at her phone in disbelief. "Brian," she called, rubbing her temple as another email popped up. "You're not going to believe this." Her husband, still groggy from a long night of catching up on work, trudged into the room, running a hand through his hair. "What's up?" She turned her phone toward him. On the screen was a headline: "Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood surprises brave 7-year-old at lemonade stand, gives $50,000 for cancer treatment." Brian blinked, then again. "Wait, what?" Claire exhaled sharply. "It's everywhere, Brian." He grabbed his phone and sure enough the story was plastered across multiple news sites. A video taken by a neighbor had already reached thousands of views, showing the exact moment Emma read the check, her eyes widening in disbelief. Emma, still in her pajamas, padded into the kitchen and yawned. "Why are you guys staring at your phones like that?" Claire looked at her daughter, the little girl who had just wanted to sell lemonade to help her parents, and smiled. "Because, sweetheart, you're kind of famous." Emma tilted her head. "Like Clint?" Brian chuckled. "Maybe not quite Clint level, but you're getting there." Emma's eyes lit up. "That's so cool." Then her face scrunched up in thought. "Wait, does this mean I have to be famous now?" Claire laughed, pulling Emma into a hug. "No, baby. It just means people saw how special you are." But as it turned out, Emma's story wasn't just being seen, it was inspiring. A movement begins by the afternoon. Claire's inbox was flooded with messages. Some were from people wanting to donate, others were from parents of children battling illnesses, sharing their own stories. And then there were the ones that made Claire pause, her heart squeezing. "My daughter is also fighting leukemia. After hearing about Emma, she wants to start her own lemonade stand to help other kids. Thank you for sharing your story. My son is currently in remission, but the medical bills have been crushing. Emma's courage gave us hope again. Is there any way we can contribute beyond just donations? We want to do something similar in our town." Claire wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from total strangers. Emma, meanwhile, was happily sitting on the floor, carefully placing a handful of letters into a shoebox she had labeled "Nice Notes" in colorful marker. "Mommy," she said suddenly, looking up, "do you think we can help other kids like me?" Claire felt something shift in her chest, a realization, a spark of something bigger. Maybe this wasn't just about Emma anymore. Maybe this was about all the kids who needed hope. And so that evening, Claire and Brian sat down at the kitchen table, brainstorming. By the time the sun had set, they had decided on something that would take Emma's lemonade stand to the next level: the Lemonade for Hope Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping families struggling with medical bills, inspired by a little girl who had once just wanted to sell a few cups of lemonade. Emma's small act of kindness had sparked something no one could have predicted, and it was only just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind. Claire and Brian worked late into the night, figuring out how to turn Emma's lemonade stand into something bigger. They set up a website, opened a donation page, and made phone calls to local businesses that might want to support the Lemonade for Hope Foundation. And the world responded. By the end of the week, donations had surpassed $100,000. But it wasn't just about the money. Something even more powerful was happening. Across the country, kids started setting up their own lemonade stands. Parents posted pictures online of their children holding up homemade Lemonade for Hope signs, tagging Emma's story as their inspiration. Schools joined in, organizing lemonade fundraisers and teaching students about the power of giving. One elementary school in Texas held an event called Lemons for Love, where students sold lemonade and sent all proceeds to childhood cancer research. A little girl in Ohio, who had also been battling leukemia, wrote a letter to Emma. "I thought I was the only one who felt scared sometimes, but you showed me that being brave means trying to help others, even when you're sick. I want to be just like you." Emma carefully placed the letter in her growing shoebox of nice notes, running her fingers over the words with a small, thoughtful smile. A few days later, a package arrived at the doorstep. Claire brought it inside, glancing at the return address. Her breath caught. Clint Eastwood. With wide eyes, she called Emma into the kitchen. "Sweetheart, you have mail." Emma climbed onto the chair eagerly as Claire opened the package. Inside was a framed photo of Emma and Clint from the lemonade stand, along with a handwritten note. "Emma, keep fighting, kid. You're making the world a better place." Clint, Emma's lips parted in surprise. "He wrote to me," she whispered, her fingers gently tracing the words. Brian, standing behind her, let out a low whistle. "That's not something most people get, kiddo." Emma smiled, small at first, then growing into something radiant. She clutched the note to her chest. "I want to make him proud." Claire's throat tightened. "Oh, sweetheart, you already have." Just when they thought things couldn't get bigger, they did. One evening, as Claire was finishing up dinner, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something in her gut told her to answer. "Hello? Hi, is this Claire Dawson?" a professional voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is the Ellen Show. We'd love to have Emma come on the show and share her story." Claire nearly dropped the phone. Her Emma was about to go from a small lemonade stand in their driveway to national television, and this was just the beginning. The studio was silent for just a moment before a wave of applause erupted, louder than anything Emma had ever heard. She looked at the screen, then at her mom, then at Ellen, trying to process what had just happened. "That's a lot of money," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ellen laughed, nodding. "It sure is, and it's going to help so many families thanks to you." Emma's small hands clutched the edge of her seat, her mind racing. She had started with just a few cups of lemonade. Now she was sitting on a stage, hearing that her simple idea had grown into something that would change lives. Claire wiped away a tear, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Emma, do you understand what this means? We can help other families who are going through the same thing as us." Emma nodded slowly, then broke into the brightest smile. That's the best part. The audience cheered again, completely won over by this tiny force of nature. Ellen grinned and turned to the screen. "Clint, before we let you go, anything else you want to say to Emma?" Clint Eastwood gave his signature smirk. "Just one thing. Kid, you've got more grit than most people I know. Don't ever lose that." Emma straightened her shoulders, nodding seriously, as if she were accepting an important mission. "I won't." Ellen laughed. "I don't think anyone doubts that." The interview wrapped up with one final surprise, a lemonade stand set up backstage, where Emma got to serve Ellen a cup on national television. The moment was captured by cameras, turned into GIFs, and spread across the internet within hours. Back at the hotel that night, Emma sat cross-legged on the bed staring at the framed photo of her and Clint that she had brought with her. "Mommy?" she asked, glancing up. "Yes, sweetheart?" Emma traced the edge of the frame with her fingers. "Do you think other kids will start their own lemonade stands now?" Claire smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "I think they already have." Emma grinned, hugging the frame to her chest. "Good. I want everyone to have hope." Claire's heart swelled with pride as she kissed Emma's forehead. "You're making sure of that, baby." As Emma drifted off to sleep, Claire sat beside her, watching the steady rise and fall of her daughter's breath. A year ago, their world had been filled with uncertainty, with fear, with nights spent wondering how they would ever get through it. Now, thanks to a lemonade stand, an unexpected visitor, and the kindness of strangers, their lives, and the lives of so many others, had been changed forever. And as Claire turned off the lamp and lay down beside her daughter, she realized something else. Hope, once just a word, had become something real, something tangible, something that, thanks to Emma, would keep growing, one cup of lemonade at a time. The days after the TV appearance were a whirlwind. Messages flooded in from people all over the country. Parents, kids, teachers, even business owners, all inspired by Emma's story. Claire and Brian barely had time to process everything before something incredible happened. A national grocery chain reached out, offering to sponsor Lemonade for Hope stands in schools across America. They wanted to provide free supplies, lemons, sugar, cups, so that kids everywhere could start their own stands to support families facing medical hardships. Then, a well-known children's hospital announced that they would be naming a new playroom after Emma, the Lemonade Room, a bright and cheerful space where kids undergoing treatment could just be kids. The impact was beyond anything they had imagined. One afternoon, as Emma sat at the kitchen table carefully folding another letter from a child who had started their own lemonade stand, she looked up at Claire. "Mommy, is this what changing the world feels like?" Claire's breath caught. She walked over, wrapping her arms around Emma and holding her close. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "This is exactly what it feels like. Through everything, the hospital stays, the exhaustion, the fear, Emma had never stopped believing in something bigger than herself. She had taken something as simple as a lemonade stand and turned it into a movement. And now, thousands of kids, families, and strangers were carrying that hope forward. That night, as Claire tucked Emma into bed, she kissed her forehead gently. "You've done something amazing, baby." Emma yawned, already half asleep, but a small, sleepy smile spread across her face. "Not just me, everybody helped." Claire smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "That's right, and they always will." As Emma drifted into dreams, filled with lemon-yellow sunshine and endless possibility, Claire sat by her bedside, overwhelmed with gratitude, because a little girl with a lemonade stand had taught the world a powerful truth. Hope is strongest when it's shared. Emma's story proves that kindness has no limits. If her journey touched your heart, take a moment to like, comment, and share this story. Let's spread the message of hope, one cup at a time.